Welcome to the cafe. Here, recently we got the revelation of the new illustrations for Volume 6. These are all the colored illustrations, not every single illustration, but what we do get is pretty interesting. We first get this proper big illustration of Shibuya. From the other illustrations, we can also get that the major locations for the Shibuya setting isn't going to be central to the main Shibuya area, but around or within the general area of Shibuya. So I'm really excited since I was really hesitant to think about is most of the action there in Shibuya Central and we're not gonna see major different locales, and I'm really excited since one of the illustrations actually confirmed that we're not gonna be doing only in the Shibuya Crossroad but also around the area of Shibuya, so I'm really excited for that point. The character we see illustrated here is of a new female character. The name hasn't been revealed, but her design aesthetics really remind me of a character from Resident Evil. And the general vibe that I get from her design is of a stereotypical lady in a garden drinking tea. And that's a bit more made more prominent when looking at her design with the shovel that she's carrying and the kettle on her waist. It really reminds me of that stereotype, and I don't know if they're really gonna be using this or focusing on it, but I'm really hoping that at least the story takes advantage of her inspiration and backstory, which is likely going to be tied to Aradia. And I'm hoping that the story won't focus on her appearance and design too much, considering that the appearance of a character is usually what Kamachi is focusing on. So I'm really hoping that's not the case with this character, and especially with Bologna. Then we see this illustration of Otanas, Syria, Index, and Toma. They look to be in an area of Shibuya that's less modern or more rural. Syria gives off a very different vibe from before, where she looked to be a bit more mature, a bit more reserved in her previous designs. Here she's a lot more flamboyant and showy, which makes me think that this isn't Syria but another character using her appearance, which can be similar to Thor during Volume 6, which can be similar to Volume 5, where we saw Thor do something similar with Misaka. I'm really surprised that the author is focusing on Index and Othanas as well with the illustration. Index and Othanas haven't been the most relevant characters in an arc, so having them return in this volume, where in the previous material it was more or less hinting that they weren't going to appear, so having them here and probably having a role that's a bit big, considering Index is the Grimoire Library and Othanas is the Magic God, or is a Magic God, it makes me interested to see where the story could go, especially with the two characters. And with the possibility of the character we see here being Syria, being a magician using her face, it's gonna be very interesting how Toma fights them all off with Bologna, as Aradia is very much hinted to be as powerful as Anna or on equal terms. Then we see this illustration of Toma, Bologna, and Aradia here is our first ever proper full body illustration, and she looks gorgeous. From the design alone, it fits her description in the light novels, and the presence she gives, presumably being able to easily beat Toma and Bologna into a corner, makes me interested how the fights are gonna be played out. Considering how powerful she is, how are Toma and Bologna gonna counter? And seeing how beat up Toma is in this illustration, him being in the pool and already being battered, and Bologna being backed into a corner, it makes me interested to see where the story could go with this dynamic, and how the story is gonna make them face off. We also have the chapter names, and they're all pretty interesting. For the title of each chapter we have Prologue, Body Weight is surprisingly not dropping. This chapter will likely be our initial setup for the volume, meeting new characters, the setup for Shibuya, and probably some new story elements for the rest of the volume.
Chapter 1, Part-Time Job at the End of the Year, Out of Nowhere.
This chapter will likely be our introduction to Syria and why they're outside of Academy City and in Shibuya, because we really don't have anything too concrete on why Toma would be taking up a job outside of Academy City, considering how going out is really big deal.
Chapter 2, Goddess of the Night, the Moon, and the Witches.
This chapter will likely be our first proper confrontation between Iridia, Toma, and Bologna. This chapter will likely be our first big confrontation for the volume, where we see Toma, Bologna, and Iridia face off. If this is going to include the new characters, Athenas, Index, who really knows, since they could easily get separated, as we know in Kamachi. But that doesn't mean they're gonna be out of the picture all the time. They're likely gonna come back in some way, but if they do get separated, it's not that surprising.
Chapter 3, Blossoming of the Transcendent.
This chapter really gives off that impression of big character development on who that could be from our protagonist side, from the antagonist side, turning against their allies. On who that could be, it's really up to the author. I really can't predict on who that could be.
Chapter 4, What's Wrong with Mere Humans, or Being Mere Human.
This chapter gives off the vibes of a big confrontation, likely with a character that got big character development and Iridia herself.
Epilogue. The needle on the record skips.
The final chapter really gives a different impression compared to other final chapters, as the epilogue hints at a time skip. Regardless of how long or quick that is, I'm guessing it's going to be linking to the next arc forward. As the title for the epilogue hints at a time skip, regardless of how long or short it is, it's very likely that this is going to be linking to Volume 7, probably going to be setting up the villain, some new plot points, maybe even a hint on who's going to be in the next chapter or arc. Volume 6 looks to be very promising in terms of content, and I'm really excited to read a chapter in a few days. Remember, you're
Thank you.
always welcome back in the cafe.